At 65 years old, Laurie Ann Carter believed her fate was sealed. She had spent the last 3 decades living for everyone else, sacrificing her own dreams, abandoning a nursing career she had loved deeply, all because her husband Robert insisted her place was at home, being a wife and mother where women belong. She had believed him. She had trusted that her dedication, her tireless work maintaining their home and raising their children, was the foundation keeping their family strong and their marriage solid. But on the day Robert asked for a divorce, sitting across from her in the lawyer's office with cold eyes and a practiced smile, the mask finally fell away. "You're not entitled to anything," he said with calculated cruelty, his attorney nodding in agreement. "I was the one who worked, who built a career, who brought in actual money. You just stayed home spending what I earned like it was your right. You contributed nothing of real value." Exhausted from 3 decades of trying to be enough, too tired to fight a legal battle she couldn't afford, wanting only to escape the humiliation, Laurie packed 2 small suitcases with her modest clothing and left for the only thing she still had in the world, the old humble house her mother Margaret had left her in Maple Ridge, a tiny forgotten village in rural North Carolina, where time itself seemed to have stopped moving. Robert laughed as she walked out, absolutely convinced she would wither away in isolation and poverty, just another discarded middle-aged woman the world would never notice again. But Robert Carter made a fatal mistake, the kind of catastrophic error that arrogant men always make when they convince themselves they succeeded alone. He forgot completely that Laurie had been the invisible foundation holding his entire empire steady. He didn't realize that the stability, the flawless organization, the emotional peace that allowed him to focus on his career, all of it had come from her. And while Laurie rediscovers a gift she buried 30 years ago and finds an authentic happiness she never imagined possible at this stage of life, Robert's carefully constructed world begins crumbling like a sandcastle meeting the tide. Wait until you see what happens when he shows up at that humble house months later, bankrupt and desperate, trying to use nostalgia as a weapon, only to discover that the place he once occupied in Laurie's life has been filled by a man who actually knows her worth, and the door Robert locked behind her when he threw her out now closes in his face forever. If you've ever been underestimated because of your age, if you've sacrificed your dreams for someone who never valued you, if you felt invisible after decades of dedication, this story is for you. Subscribe now, because what Laurie discovers in a dusty box in her mother's attic will make you believe it's never too late to bloom again. Welcome to Dreams Don't Age. Laurie Ann Carter had been 28 when she married Robert Carter, a confident 31-year-old junior executive with ambitions that filled every room he entered. It was 1988, and Laurie had just completed her nursing degree, passing her boards with honors, already accepting a position at Charlotte Memorial Hospital in the cardiac care unit. She'd worked so hard for that degree. Night classes while working as a waitress, student loans she'd carefully planned to repay, a dream of helping people that had burned bright since childhood. Robert had seemed perfect, handsome, successful, attentive in ways that made her feel special. When he proposed after 8 months of dating, she'd said yes immediately, thrilled at the prospect of building a life with someone so sure of himself, so clearly going places. They'd married quickly, a small ceremony that Robert insisted on keeping modest because he was saving for their future. 3 months into the marriage, Laurie discovered she was pregnant. She'd been nervous but excited, already planning how she'd balance her new nursing career with motherhood. But Robert had other ideas. "You can't seriously be thinking about working," he'd said, his voice taking on an edge she hadn't heard before. "Babies need their mothers at home. That's what good mothers do. They sacrifice their careers for their children. My mother did it, and I turned out fine." Laurie had hesitated, torn between the career she'd fought so hard for and the traditional picture of motherhood Robert painted. "But we could use my income," she'd suggested gently. "We could save for a house, build security." "Are you saying I can't provide for my family?" Robert's voice had gone cold. "Is that what you're implying? That I'm not man enough to support my wife and child?" The argument had escalated until Laurie, exhausted and emotional from early pregnancy, had backed down. She'd called Charlotte Memorial and declined the position, her heart breaking as she did it. She told herself it was temporary, that she'd return to nursing once the baby was older. Their son, David, was born in 1989. 18 months later came their daughter, Sarah, and somehow temporary became permanent. Robert's career flourished. He moved from junior executive to senior management, to vice president of operations at a manufacturing company. Each promotion meant longer hours, more travel, more stress that he brought home expecting Laurie to manage. "I need you to handle this," became his constant refrain. "I'm building our future. The least you can do is keep the home running smoothly." So Laurie ran the home. She managed every detail of their household: cooking, cleaning, shopping, budgeting, maintaining the house, handling repairs, managing the children's schedules, volunteering at their schools, organizing every holiday and birthday and family obligation. She was the one who sat up all night when the children were sick. She was the one who attended every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every sporting event. She was the one who made sure Robert's life ran so smoothly he never had to think about anything except his career. And slowly, year by year, Laurie Ann, the nurse with dreams, became Laurie the wife, Laurie the mother, Laurie whose identity existed only in relation to other people. Her nursing license expired because she never renewed it. Her textbooks went into boxes in the attic. Her scrubs were donated to Goodwill. The person she'd worked so hard to become simply disappeared, replaced by a woman whose value was measured entirely by how well she served others. Robert's paychecks grew larger. They moved from a modest apartment to a nice house to an impressive house in the best neighborhood. Robert bought expensive cars, joined exclusive clubs, played golf with influential people. Laurie wore the clothes he chose for her, entertained the colleagues he needed to impress, smiled at parties where people asked what she did, and she had to say, "I'm a homemaker," while feeling the judgment in their eyes. The children grew up. David became distant, so focused on following his father's footsteps into business that he barely called. Sarah moved across the country for her career and visited rarely. Both of them had absorbed Robert's attitude that their mother's contributions were somehow less valuable because she didn't earn a paycheck. And Laurie, at 55, had looked around and realized she'd spent 3 decades building a life where she was essential but invisible, needed but not valued. She'd tried to reconnect with nursing, researching what it would take to get recertified, but Robert had been furious. "Now? You want to embarrass me now by going back to work like we need the money? After everything I've built? People will think I'm failing." The answer is absolutely not. So Laurie had stayed. She'd convinced herself that being needed was enough, that keeping Robert's life running smoothly was enough, that surely after 30 years of dedication, he valued her even if he didn't show it. She was wrong. Robert asked for the divorce 3 months after their 30th anniversary. He'd taken her to dinner at an expensive restaurant, and Laurie had thought maybe, finally, he was going to acknowledge everything she'd done, all the years she'd sacrificed. Instead, he'd handed her legal papers across the table. "I want a divorce," he'd said simply, as if discussing a business transaction. "I've met someone else, someone with ambition, with a career, someone who actually contributes something to a partnership. You've become dead weight, Laurie. You don't do anything except spend my money and occupy space in my house." The words had hit like physical blows. "Someone else?" Laurie had whispered. "You're having an affair." "Don't be dramatic," Robert had said dismissively. "I'm being honest about what I need in this phase of my life. You served your purpose raising the children, but they're grown now. I need a partner who can stand beside me socially, who has something to offer beyond cooking and cleaning. Angela is a marketing executive. She's sophisticated, accomplished, relevant. You're just a housewife who never did anything with her life." Laurie had sat in that restaurant, the expensive meal untouched in front of her, and felt 30 years of her life reduced to worthless service. The divorce proceedings had been brutal in their efficiency. Robert had expensive attorneys who argued that since Laurie hadn't contributed financially to the marriage, she was entitled to minimal support. "She has no job skills, No recent work history, no education that's still relevant after 3 decades, his lawyer had argued. But that's not Mr. Carter's fault. He gave her a comfortable life. She chose not to maintain her career. He shouldn't be penalized for her choices. Laurie's court-appointed attorney had tried to argue for her contributions, for 30 years of unpaid labor, for the fact that she'd sacrificed her career so Robert could build his. But Robert's legal team was too good, too ruthless. In the end, Laurie received a modest one-time settlement that would last maybe 2 years if she was extremely careful, and nothing else. Robert kept the house, the cars, the retirement accounts, the investments. You contributed nothing of monetary value, the judge had ruled. While your domestic contributions are acknowledged, they don't entitle you to half of assets you didn't help earn. Laurie had walked out of that courthouse at 65 years old with a check for $50,000, 2 suitcases of clothes, and the deed to her mother's old house in Maple Ridge, a property so modest Robert hadn't even bothered trying to claim it in the divorce. As she'd loaded her car, Robert had pulled up beside her in his BMW, the window rolling down. "You should thank me," he'd said with a cold smile. "I'm setting you free to finally do something with your life, though we both know it's too late for that. You're 65 with no skills and no prospects. You'll probably end up in some subsidized housing somewhere, finally getting what you deserved all along." He'd driven away laughing, and Laurie had sat in her old Honda Civic, the one car he'd let her keep because it was barely worth the paperwork, and cried until she had no tears left. The drive from Charlotte to Maple Ridge took 3 hours through increasingly rural North Carolina landscape. As highways became country roads and country roads became barely maintained lanes, Laurie felt like she was traveling backward through time. Maple Ridge was exactly as she remembered from childhood visits. A tiny village that time had forgotten, consisting of maybe 24 houses clustered around a small commercial area, with a general store, a post office, a church, and not much else. Population maybe 200 people, most of them elderly, all of them seeming to know each other's business. Her mother Margaret's house sat at the end of a dirt road, separated from the village center by a 1/4 mile of overgrown path. It was small, maybe 900 square feet, 1 story, built in the 1940s from wood that had weathered to gray. The paint was peeling. The porch sagged. Weeds had overtaken what had once been her mother's vegetable garden. It looked abandoned, forgotten, sad. Laurie sat in her car and stared at it, this final destination, this endpoint of 30 years of service. Her mother had died 2 years ago, and Laurie had been too busy managing Robert's life to do anything with the property. Now it was all she had. She unlocked the door with the old key her mother's lawyer had sent her and stepped inside. The smell of abandonment hit her immediately. Dust, mildew, the mustiness of a house that hadn't been aired out in years. Furniture sat exactly where her mother had left it, now covered in dust. Dishes in the kitchen cupboards, clothes still in the bedroom closet. Gay life interrupted and never resumed. Laurie walked through the small rooms, living room, kitchen, bedroom, tiny bathroom, and felt the weight of her situation crash down on her. This was it. This was what 3 decades of dedication had earned her. A falling-apart house in a forgotten village where she knew no one, with $50,000 that would barely last 2 years, no career to return to, no prospects, and the rest of her life stretching ahead, empty and meaningless. She sat on her mother's old couch and let herself break down completely. Not the quiet tears she'd cried before, but deep, body-shaking sobs of grief for everything she'd lost. Her career, her identity, her 30 years, her future. All of it gone because she'd believed Robert when he said her contributions mattered, when he said her sacrifice was valuable, when he implied that dedication would be rewarded. She'd been a fool. And now she was alone, forgotten, used up and thrown away like something past its expiration date. That first night, Laurie slept on the dusty couch because she didn't have the energy to clean the bedroom. She woke up stiff and aching, the reality of her situation somehow worse in daylight. She was 65 years old. She had no job, no career, no money beyond what would last 2 years at most. She had children who barely called. She had skills that were 3 decades out of date. What was she supposed to do now? The despair was overwhelming, crushing, suffocating. For several long minutes, Laurie genuinely wondered if there was any point in continuing. But then she heard her mother's voice in her memory, a phrase Margaret had said often. "Self-pity is a luxury we can't afford, baby girl. When life knocks you down, you get up and you do the next right thing, one step at a time." The next right thing. Laurie stood up, her body protesting, and looked around the dusty, neglected house. The next right thing was to make this place livable. She might not have a future, but she could at least have a clean place to exist in while she figured out what came next. Laurie spent the next 2 weeks in a fog of physical labor that kept her mind mercifully occupied. She cleaned. She scrubbed floors until her knees ached, and her hands were raw. She washed every surface, every window, every dish. She laundered curtains and linens. She pulled weeds from the garden with a vengeance. As if each weed was a piece of her past she could physically rip out and discard. The work was exhausting, but somehow therapeutic. Each cleaned room, each cleared space, felt like a small victory against the chaos her life had become. The village people watched her with curiosity, but kept their distance at first. Maple Ridge was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and strangers were notable. Laurie could feel eyes on her when she went to the general store for supplies, could hear the whispers that stopped when she got too close. "That's Margaret's daughter," she heard someone say. "The one who moved away 30 years ago. Heard her husband divorced her, left her with nothing." The pity in their voices stung worse than contempt would have. One afternoon during her 3rd week in Maple Ridge, while Laurie was attacking the overgrown garden with a determination born of desperation, a man approached from the road. He was probably in his early 60s, with silver hair, weathered hands, and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. "Afternoon," he said pleasantly. "You must be Margaret's daughter. I'm Samuel Hayes. People call me Sam. I live down the road about half a mile." He gestured vaguely behind him. "I knew your mother pretty well. She was a good woman. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," Laurie managed, suddenly aware of how she must look. Sweaty, dirty, hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing old clothes. "I'm Laurie. I can see you're working hard on the place," Sam said. "Your mother would be glad to see it cared for again. I'm a carpenter by trade, retired now mostly, but I still do odd jobs. If you need any repairs done, and I can see from here the porch could use some work, I'd be happy to help. Reasonable rates and I do good work." Laurie looked at the sagging porch, then at her dwindling bank account. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not sure I can afford repairs right now." "Well, the offer stands whenever you're ready," Sam said kindly. "And if you need anything, advice on the house, recommendations for where to shop, anything at all, I'm happy to help. Maple Ridge is a good place once you get to know folks. We take care of each other here." There was something genuine in his tone that made Laurie's throat tight with unexpected emotion. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That means more than you know." After Sam left, Laurie stood in her mother's garden and cried again, but this time not entirely from despair. There was something here, something in the kindness of a stranger, that felt different from the cold, transactional world she'd left behind. During those weeks of cleaning, Laurie found herself drawn again and again to her mother's bedroom, the space she'd been avoiding because it felt too personal, too final. But she needed to clean it, to decide what to keep and what to let go. Margaret had been gone 2 years, but the room still held traces of her reading glasses on the nightstand, her favorite blanket folded at the foot of the bed, her Bible with passages underlined and notes in the margins. Laurie found herself reading those notes, connecting with her mother in a way she hadn't been able to when Margaret was alive. One afternoon, while cleaning out the closet, Laurie found a box shoved far back on the top shelf. It was an old cardboard box, taped shut, with Laurie's things written on it in her mother's handwriting. Curious, Laurie pulled it down and carefully cut the tape. Inside was her past, carefully preserved. Her nursing school textbooks, her uniform, her stethoscope, her name badge from Charlotte Memorial, and at the very bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, was her nursing school diploma and her original nursing license. Laurie pulled out each item with shaking hands, memories flooding back. She'd been good at nursing, really good. She'd loved the work, the sense of purpose, the direct impact she could have on people's lives. She remembered the thrill of her first successful IV insertion, the satisfaction of calming a frightened patient, the profound meaning of holding someone's hand through their final moments. She'd given all of that up because Robert had convinced her it wasn't valuable, that being a wife and mother was her only real purpose. But holding that diploma now, Laurie felt something she hadn't felt in years, a spark of who she'd been before she'd disappeared into being someone's wife. She'd been Laurie Ann Matthews, RN. She'd been someone with skills and knowledge and the ability to save lives. She'd had value that didn't depend on who she was married to or how well she kept her house. She'd been somebody. That night, Laurie sat at her mother's kitchen table with her old nursing textbooks spread out before her, reading by lamplight, and for the first time since the divorce, she didn't feel entirely hopeless. Maybe, just maybe, there was still something of the old Laurie left inside the shell Robert had created. Maybe it wasn't too late to find her again. The transformation came unexpectedly on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after Laurie had arrived in Maple Ridge. She'd developed a routine, early morning coffee on the now cleaned porch, days spent working on the house and garden, evenings reading her old nursing textbooks and wondering if recertification was even possible at her age. The house was starting to feel less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. The garden was coming back to life under her careful attention. She'd even started to recognize faces in the village, to receive tentative nods of greeting. That Thursday, Laurie was in the garden when she heard a commotion from the direction of the road. Voices raised in panic, someone shouting for help. Without thinking, she dropped her gardening gloves and ran toward the sound. 3 houses down, a small crowd had gathered around someone lying on the ground. An elderly woman, maybe early 70s, collapsed on the sidewalk. Her neighbor was on his phone calling 911, his voice shaking. "She just grabbed her chest and fell," he was saying. "I don't know if she's breathing. Please hurry." Laurie pushed through the small crowd, and 30 years of training that had been dormant but never truly forgotten took over instantly. She dropped to her knees beside the woman, her hands automatically going to check for a pulse. "I'm a nurse," she said, with an authority she hadn't used in decades. "Someone tell me her name." "Dorothy," someone said. "Dorothy Fletcher. She lives alone. We were just talking and she—" "Dorothy, can you hear me?" Laurie said clearly, finding a faint, irregular pulse. Dorothy's eyes fluttered but didn't focus. Her breathing was shallow and labored, classic symptoms of a heart attack. "Someone get me aspirin if anyone has it," Laurie ordered. "And a blanket. She's going into shock." Her hands moved automatically, checking airway, positioning Dorothy correctly, monitoring her breathing. Someone thrust aspirin at her, and Laurie carefully administered it, talking to Dorothy in a calm, steady voice even though the woman seemed only semi-conscious. "You're going to be fine, Dorothy. Help is coming. I'm right here with you. Just keep breathing for me. Nice and steady." The crowd had gone silent, everyone watching as Laurie worked. Her training had come back so completely it was like she'd never stopped practicing. She monitored Dorothy's vitals, adjusted her position, kept talking to her in that calm, professional voice that kept both the patient and the anxious crowd from panicking. When the ambulance finally arrived 12 minutes later, the nearest hospital was 30 miles away, and response times in rural areas were always slow. The EMTs found Dorothy stable, conscious, and being expertly managed by a confident woman they didn't recognize. "I'm Laurie Carter," she told them as they took over. "Registered nurse, though my license expired." She presented with classic MI symptoms approximately 15 minutes ago. "I've administered 325 mg aspirin, monitored her airway and breathing, managed for shock. Pulse is thready but stable, breathing labored but adequate. She's been conscious and responsive for the past 8 minutes." The lead EMT looked at her with respect. "You might have saved her life. Another few minutes without intervention and she'd have been in serious trouble. Thank you." As the ambulance pulled away with Dorothy inside, Laurie stood there breathing hard, adrenaline still coursing through her system, and then she realized the crowd was staring at her, but not with pity anymore, with awe. "You're a nurse," someone said. "You saved Dorothy's life," another person breathed. "We thought she was dying. You knew exactly what to do." Sam Hayes was there in the crowd, and he was smiling at her with something like pride. "Your mother told me once that you'd gone to nursing school, but I didn't know you'd actually practiced. That was incredible, Laurie." Laurie looked at her hands, still steady despite the adrenaline, and felt something inside her shift and settle. For 30 years, Robert had convinced her that she had no valuable skills, that she'd wasted her education, that she was nothing more than a woman who'd spent his money and occupied his space. But in those crucial minutes with Dorothy Fletcher's life in her hands, Laurie had been exactly who she'd trained to be. Competent, skilled, essential, valuable, not because of who she was married to or how well she kept a house, but because of knowledge and ability that no one could take away from her no matter how hard they tried. That evening, Laurie sat on her porch with her old nursing textbooks and looked up what it would take to get recertified in North Carolina. It wouldn't be easy. She'd need refresher courses, clinical hours, an exam. But suddenly, for the first time in 30 years, she wasn't thinking about what Robert wanted or what was convenient for someone else. She was thinking about what she wanted, and what she wanted was to be Laurie Ann Carter, RN again. Word spread through Maple Ridge with the speed that only small villages achieve. By the next day, everyone knew that Margaret's daughter was a nurse who'd saved Dorothy Fletcher's life. The looks Laurie received when she went to the general store had changed from pitying to respectful. People introduced themselves, thanked her, asked if she was planning to stay. Dorothy Fletcher was released from the hospital 3 days later with stents placed and a prescription for cardiac care. She came directly to Laurie's house, moving slowly but determined. "I needed to thank you," Dorothy said, her eyes filling with tears. "The doctors said if you hadn't known what to do, I would have died before the ambulance got there. You gave me my life back." Laurie invited her in for tea, and they talked for 2 hours. Dorothy was 72, a widow, living alone, trying to manage multiple health conditions without much support. "The nearest doctor is 30 miles away," Dorothy explained. "Hard for folks here to get regular care. Most people just hope they don't get sick and deal with emergencies when they happen." An idea began forming in Laurie's mind. That evening, she called the North Carolina Board of Nursing and explained her situation. She was a lapsed RN who wanted to get recertified. What were her options? The process would take time. Refresher courses she could do online, clinical hours she'd need to arrange, an exam to retake. But it was possible. She could be recertified within 6 months if she worked hard. Laurie enrolled immediately, using part of her limited settlement money to pay for the courses. She studied every evening, relearning procedures, absorbing new protocols, catching up on 30 years of medical advances. It was exhausting but exhilarating, like finding a part of herself she'd thought was dead. During the days, word of her nursing background spread further. People started coming to her door with questions. Could she look at this rash? Check this blood pressure? Explain these medication instructions? Laurie couldn't practice officially without her license, but she could offer advice, education, reassurance. The village elders especially appreciated having someone who could explain medical information in terms they understood. Sam Hayes became a regular visitor, always with some excuse. Advice about the porch repair, vegetables from his garden, an invitation to a community dinner. Laurie found herself looking forward to his visits, to his gentle humor and genuine kindness. He was so different from Robert, quiet where Robert had been domineering, thoughtful where Robert had been dismissive, interested in her thoughts where Robert had dismissed them. "You're blooming," Sam observed one afternoon, while helping her repair the garden fence. "When you first got here, you looked like someone who'd been broken. Now you look alive again." He was right. Laurie could feel it herself. The despair that had consumed her those first weeks was giving way to something else, purpose, direction, the sense that maybe her life wasn't over, but actually just beginning in a new form. 6 months after arriving in Maple Ridge, Laurie took her recertification exam in Charlotte. She passed with high scores. 3 days later, her new RN license arrived in the mail. Laurie held it and cried, but this time they were tears of accomplishment and vindication. She was officially Laurie Ann Carter, RN again. She opened a small health consulting practice in her home. Nothing fancy, but a service the village desperately needed. She couldn't handle emergencies alone, but she could provide basic health assessments, chronic disease management education, medication counseling, and coordinate care with doctors 30 miles away. She charged modest fees that elderly people on fixed incomes could afford. Word spread beyond Maple Ridge. People from neighboring villages started coming. Laurie's little house became a hub of healthcare access for a rural community that had been underserved for decades. She was busy, fulfilled, needed in a way that had nothing to do with making someone else's life convenient. And she was happy, genuinely, authentically happy in a way she'd never been during 30 years of marriage. Sam Hayes asked her to dinner 8 months after she'd arrived. A real date, he clarified, not just neighbors being friendly. I know you're still healing from everything you went through, he said, and I'm not trying to rush you, but I think you're remarkable, Laurie, and I'd like the chance to spend more time with you, if you're interested. Laurie was interested. Sam treated her like she mattered, like her thoughts and feelings and experiences were valuable. He listened when she talked. He supported her work. He celebrated her successes. He was everything Robert had never been, kind, respectful, genuinely caring about her as a person, rather than as a function he needed her to perform. Their relationship developed slowly, naturally, built on friendship and mutual respect, rather than the transactional dynamics Laurie had accepted for so long. Sam was patient with her healing, understanding that 30 years of being diminished didn't disappear overnight. And as Laurie's practice grew and her confidence rebuilt, and her sense of self solidified, she found herself falling in love in a way she'd never experienced before, as an equal partner, valued and respected. Meanwhile, though Laurie didn't know it yet, Robert Carter's carefully constructed empire was crumbling. Robert Carter's downfall didn't happen all at once. It was gradual, insidious, a slow collapse that he didn't even recognize until it was too late to stop. The first sign came within weeks of Laurie's departure. The house that had always run smoothly suddenly became chaotic. Bills that Laurie had always paid on time started getting missed because Robert forgot them. Appointments he'd always made got skipped because he'd never actually kept track of his own schedule. Laurie had done that. Social obligations he'd always smoothly navigated became awkward because Laurie wasn't there to remind him of names, details, who was allergic to what, whose spouse had just died. Angela, the sophisticated marketing executive he'd left Laurie for, had no interest in managing Robert's domestic life. I have my own career, she told him when he asked her to handle his dry cleaning. We're partners, remember? Equal partners, which means you handle your own stuff. Robert found himself drowning in details he'd never paid attention to before. His house became cluttered and disorganized. He missed his doctor's appointments and let his prescriptions lapse. He forgot his daughter Sarah's birthday entirely and didn't realize it until she called him furious. At work, the problems multiplied. Robert had always presented himself as organized and on top of everything. But the organization had come from Laurie, who'd managed his calendar, prepared his materials, made sure he was ready for every meeting. Without her, Robert started missing deadlines, showing up unprepared, forgetting commitments. His colleagues noticed. Then came the financial problems. Robert had convinced himself and everyone else that he was a brilliant businessman. But the truth was more complicated. He was good at sales, at presenting ideas, at networking. But the detailed financial management, the careful budgeting, the strategic planning, Laurie had done all of that for their household, and her organizational skills had spilled over into advice she'd given him about his career moves. Without her steady hand, Robert made impulsive decisions. He invested heavily in a startup that failed within months. He took out loans for renovations on the house that turned out to be unnecessary and overpriced. He spent lavishly on Angela, trying to impress her, not tracking what he was spending. His savings started depleting faster than they should have. Angela, sensing instability, started pulling back. "I thought you were successful," she said, when Robert had to ask her to split dinner bills. "I thought you had everything together." "I do," Robert insisted, but they both knew it was becoming a lie. The manufacturing company where Robert had risen to VP of operations began having problems. Market changes, increased competition, internal conflicts. The company needed steady leadership, strategic thinking, calm management. But Robert, stressed and scattered, unable to manage even his own life effectively, wasn't providing any of those things. 9 months after Laurie left, the board asked for Robert's resignation. They phrased it nicely: early retirement, generous severance, appreciation for his years of service. But Robert understood what it really meant. He'd failed. At 68 years old, Robert found himself forced into retirement with a severance package that seemed generous until he calculated how much debt he'd accumulated. The house was mortgaged. His savings were depleted. His retirement accounts were smaller than they should have been because he'd borrowed against them for bad investments. Angela left him the week after he lost his job. "I thought you had your life together," she said simply. "I need someone stable. This isn't working." Within a year of divorcing Laurie, Robert Carter found himself living in a small apartment, struggling to pay rent, watching his comfortable life evaporate. And the worst part was that he was starting to realize why. Every area where his life was falling apart had been an area Laurie had quietly managed. The organization, the planning, the steady hand that kept everything running, that had been her. The success he'd claimed as entirely his own had been built on her invisible labor. He'd convinced himself she contributed nothing of value because she didn't earn a paycheck. But she'd been the foundation of his entire life, and without her, everything was crumbling. Desperate, broke, and finally understanding what he'd lost, Robert made a decision. He would go to Maple Ridge. He would find Laurie. Surely she'd take him back. She had nowhere else to go. Nothing else. No one else. She'd be grateful to reconcile, to have purpose again. He'd made a mistake, but it was fixable. They could rebuild. These thoughts sustained Robert as he drove his old car. The BMW was repossessed, through North Carolina backroads toward Maple Ridge, toward what he imagined would be a tearful reconciliation with a woman who needed him as much as he now needed her. Robert arrived in Maple Ridge on a gray afternoon 15 months after the divorce. He'd called ahead to David and Sarah, both of whom barely spoke to him anymore since they'd realized their mother had been telling the truth about how poorly he'd treated her, and gotten Laurie's address from Sarah after claiming he wanted to apologize and make things right. The village was even more pathetic than he'd imagined. Barely 24 houses, primitive-looking businesses, roads that were barely paved. How had Laurie survived here for over a year? She must be desperate, lonely, ready for him to rescue her from this backwater. He drove slowly down the dirt road toward the address Sarah had given him, rehearsing his speech. He'd be humble, apologetic, just enough to get his foot in the door. He'd remind her of good times. He'd hint that he'd been wrong. He'd make her believe she still needed him. And then he turned the corner and stopped. The house wasn't what he'd expected. It wasn't falling apart or neglected. It was modest but charming, freshly painted in soft yellow with white trim, the porch rebuilt and sturdy, flower boxes bursting with blooms, a vegetable garden thriving beside it. Wind chimes hung from the porch, creating gentle music. The whole property looked cared for, loved, alive. A sign by the front door read, "Laurie Carter, RN, Health Consulting, Walk-ins welcome." RN? Laurie was working as a nurse? Robert's confusion deepened as he got out of his car. A man was working on the porch steps, maybe 65, with grey hair and carpenter's hands, whistling while he worked. When he saw Robert, he straightened, his expression friendly but cautious. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for Laurie Carter," Robert said. I'm Robert, her ex-husband." The man's expression went immediately cold. "You're Robert." It wasn't a question. He set down his tools and crossed his arms. "Laurie's mentioned you. I'm Sam, a friend." The way he said friend suggested something more. Robert felt the first stirrings of panic. Before he could respond, the front door opened and Laurie stepped out. Robert almost didn't recognize her. She looked younger than she had during their marriage, despite being 15 months older. Her hair was silver white now, but styled attractively instead of the conservative bun she'd always worn. She wore casual clothes that actually fit her personality, instead of the formal outfits he'd always insisted on. But more than her appearance, it was her bearing that shocked him. She stood straight, confident, meeting his eyes with a steadiness he'd never seen before. "Robert," she said calmly, "what are you doing here?" "I needed to see you," Robert said, trying to inject warmth into his voice. "To talk. Can we talk privately?" Laurie glanced at Sam, who nodded and stepped aside but didn't leave. She gestured to the porch chairs. "We can talk here. Whatever you need to say, you can say in front of Sam." Robert sat reluctantly, very aware of Sam's protective presence. I wanted to apologize," he began. "I made mistakes during our marriage. I didn't appreciate everything you did. I've had time to think, and I realize now how much you contributed." Laurie listened without expression. Robert continued, gaining confidence. "The thing is, Laurie, I'm struggling. The divorce hit me harder than I expected, financially and emotionally. Angela left. I lost my job. I'm barely making ends meet. And I keep thinking about how good we were together, how stable our life was." He leaned forward, trying to look sincere. "I think we made a mistake. I think we should try again. You must be lonely here, barely getting by. We could rebuild together. Go back to Charlotte, start over. I forgive you for leaving." The silence that followed was absolute. Then, to Robert's shock, Sam started laughing, not cruelly but with genuine amusement. Laurie wasn't laughing, but there was something in her eyes that looked almost like pity. "Robert," she said quietly, "I need to make something very clear. I'm not lonely. I'm not barely getting by. I'm not waiting for you to rescue me. I have a successful health consulting practice that serves this community and 3 neighboring villages. I have friends, purpose, work that matters. I'm happy, genuinely happy, in a way I never was during 30 years of marriage to you." Robert felt panic rising. "But you can't be serious about staying here. This is nowhere. You could come back to Charlotte, have a real life again." "This is my real life," Laurie said firmly. "More real than anything I had with you. And I'm not doing it alone." She reached out, and Sam took her hand naturally, the gesture speaking volumes. "Sam and I have been together for 6 months. He treats me like an equal partner, values my work, supports my dreams. He's everything you never were." "You can't be serious," Robert said, his voice rising. "Him, a carpenter in a backwater village? Laurie, I'm offering you a chance to get your life back." "No," Laurie said, standing up. "You're offering me a chance to go back to being invisible, unvalued, and taken for granted. My life back would mean returning to serving someone who convinced me I was worthless. I'd rather die." "You're going to regret this," Robert threatened. "You think you're happy now, but wait until your money runs out and this whole little fantasy collapses." "My money is fine," Laurie said. "I earn a good living doing work I love, but even if I was broke, I'd still be happier than I ever was spending your money and listening to you tell me I contributed nothing." Robert played his last card. "The children want us to reconcile. David and Sarah miss having a family." "I've talked to David and Sarah," Laurie said. "After they finally understood how you treated me, they apologized for not seeing it sooner. They visit me here. They're proud of what I've built. And they've made it clear they have no interest in reconciling with you until you actually acknowledge what you did wrong, which notably, you still haven't actually done. You said you made mistakes, but you didn't specify what those mistakes were. You said you didn't appreciate what I did, but you didn't admit that you deliberately belittled and diminished me for 30 years. She walked to the porch edge, looking down at him. "You came here thinking I'd be desperate and grateful to have you back. You came here expecting to find me broken and ready to serve you again. But I'm not that person anymore, Robert. I don't need your forgiveness for leaving because leaving was the best decision I ever made. And I certainly don't need your rescue. You'll change your mind," Robert said desperately. "When reality sets in, when you realize what you're giving up." "I'm not giving up anything," Laurie said quietly. "I'm choosing a life where I'm valued for who I am, not what I can do for someone else. I'm choosing a partner who sees me as an equal. I'm choosing work that uses my skills and helps people. I'm choosing happiness, and none of those choices include you." She walked to the door, Sam beside her. "Goodbye, Robert, don't come back." As they stepped inside and closed the door, Robert heard the unmistakable sound of a lock clicking into place. He stood there, staring at that closed door, finally understanding that Laurie wasn't coming back. She didn't need him. She'd never actually needed him. He'd needed her, but he'd been too arrogant to see it until it was too late. Robert got in his car and drove away from Maple Ridge, back toward his empty apartment and his uncertain future, finally understanding exactly how much he'd lost. 18 months after arriving in Maple Ridge, Laurie stood on her porch watching the sun set over the village, Sam's arm around her shoulders, and thought about how strange life was. She'd come here convinced her life was over, that being divorced and broke at 65 meant all her possibilities were exhausted. Instead, she'd found purpose, community, love, and most importantly, herself. Her health consulting practice was thriving. She'd recently hired an assistant and was training 2 younger nurses who wanted to work in rural health. The village had become so appreciative of her work that they'd helped her expand her house, adding a proper office space and a small clinic area. Sam had done most of the construction himself, refusing payment, insisting that seeing her happy was reward enough. Besides, he'd said with that gentle smile she'd come to love, "I'm investing in our future. This is as much my house now as yours, isn't it?" It was. They'd made it official 3 months ago. Not marriage, not yet, but a committed partnership. Sam had moved in, and they were building a life together as genuine equals. He supported her work, she supported his carpentry business, and they built their home and their relationship with mutual respect and love. David and Sarah had visited twice now, staying for whole weekends, apologizing repeatedly for not seeing how poorly their father had treated Laurie. "We absorbed his attitude," David had said, his voice thick with regret. "We thought you were just a housewife, that what you did wasn't real work. We were so wrong, Mum, we're proud of you." That had meant everything. Dorothy Fletcher, fully recovered and healthy thanks to Laurie's continued monitoring, had become one of Laurie's closest friends. "How you gave me my life back," Dorothy said often, "and you gave this whole village something it needed, someone who actually cares." Word of Robert's visit had spread through Maple Ridge within hours, and the village had collectively rallied around Laurie. "You want us to make sure he doesn't come back?" several people had offered. Laurie had declined, knowing that Robert was gone for good. He'd come expecting to find weakness, and had found strength instead. That was the best revenge. Not vengeance, but simply living well. Laurie's old nursing textbook sat on her shelf now, well worn from reference, but supplemented by current medical texts. Her diploma hung on the wall of her clinic, a reminder that education and skills could never really be taken away, only temporarily set aside. And next to it hung a new frame containing a quote from Margaret, something Laurie's mother had written in her Bible, and Laurie had discovered during those early cleaning days. "A woman's worth is not measured by who claims to own her, but by who she becomes when she claims herself." As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, Sam kissed Laurie's temple. "What are you thinking about?" "How lucky I am," Laurie said honestly. "I thought losing everything meant my life was over. But it turned out I hadn't lost everything. I'd just finally been freed from someone who convinced me I was nothing. And once I was free, I could become who I was always meant to be." Sam smiled. "You know what I think? I think you didn't bloom late. I think you were always blooming, but someone kept cutting you back, keeping you small. You just needed the space to grow into your full size." That was exactly right. Laurie Ann Carter, RN, at 66 years old, was finally fully authentically herself, and she was magnificent. "I am overwhelmed with gratitude that you stayed with Laurie through her entire journey, from devastating humiliation to powerful rebirth, from being told she was worthless to discovering she was invaluable. If her story touched something deep within you, if you've ever been told you contributed nothing because your work wasn't a paycheck, if you've sacrificed your dreams for someone who never valued you, if you've ever wondered if it's too late to reclaim who you were meant to be, leave one word in the comments describing the moment you realized your worth wasn't defined by anyone's opinion of you. Because Laurie's story proves something powerful and true, that your skills and knowledge can never be truly taken from you, only temporarily set aside. That being needed and being valued are completely different things. That leaving someone who diminishes you isn't giving up. It's choosing yourself. That 65, 70, 80, these aren't endings but opportunities to finally bloom into your authentic self. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that the work they did, raising children, managing households, supporting partners, that was real work with real value, even if it never appeared on a paycheck. Because together we prove that dreams don't age, worth doesn't expire, and sometimes the worst thing that happens to you, being left with nothing, turns out to be the door opening to everything you were always meant to have. Welcome to our family of late bloomers who are just getting started. See you in the next story.